The Type 95 Hago was a light tank used by the Imperial Japanese Army in combat operations of the Second Sino-Japanese War, at Nomonhan against the Soviet Union, and in the Second World War. It proved sufficient against infantry, but, like the American M3 Stuart, it was not designed to fight other tanks. Approximately 2,300 units were produced, making it the most numerous Japanese armored fighting vehicle of the time. History and development. From early 1930s, the Japanese Army began experimenting on a mechanized warfare unit combining infantry with tanks. However, the Type 89 medium tank could not keep pace with the motorized infantry, which could move at 40 km/h by truck. In combat, motorized infantry could only hope to achieve 40 km advance per day. For transport, tanks could be loaded on train platforms like in any other army of the times. To solve this problem, the Army Technical Bureau proposed a new light tank of 7 tons or less capable of 40 km/h speed and started development in 1933. The prototype of the new tank was begun in 1933 and completed in 1934 at the Army's Sagami Arsenal. Initial tests were positive, but it was too heavy at 7.5 tons and had to be reworked, bringing the weight down to 6.5 t. Due to doubts by the infantry as to its capability for infantry support, it was tested in Manchuria in the winter of 1934–1935. The reports were favorable and a second prototype built, being completed in November 1935. In 1935, at a meeting in the Army Technical Bureau, the Type 95 was proposed as the main tank for mechanized infantry units. The infantry had concerns that the armor was insufficient. However, the cavalry indicated that the improved speed and armament compensated for thin armor. In the end, the infantry agreed, as the Type 95 was still superior to the only available alternative, which was the Type 92 heavy armored car. Production was started in 1936 by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. By 1939, 100 units had been built. Mitsubishi would go on to build a total of 853 in their own factories, with another 1,250 units built by the Sagami Arsenal, Hitachi Industries, Niigata Tekosho, Kobe Seikosho, and Kokura Arsenal. Design. The Type 95 was a 7.4-TONNE vehicle with a complement of 3 crewmen, a commander, a hull machine gunner, and a driver. Only the commander was seated in the turret, hence he was responsible for observation, loading, aiming, firing the main gun, as well as decision-making and commanding the crew. The hand-operated turret was small and extremely cramped. The primary armament of the most produced version was a Type 94 37mm tank gun with the barrel length of 46.1 calibers. It elevated between -15 to +20 degrees. The tank carried 2 types of 37mm ammunition, the high explosive and armor-piercing. For the latter, muzzle velocity was 1,900 feet per second and the armor penetration was 1.4 inches at a distance of 300 yards. Secondary armament was 2 7.7mm Type 97 light machine guns, one mounted in the hull front and the other in the back of the turret, facing to the rear right. The most characteristic feature of the Type 95 tank was its simple suspension system. 2 bogie wheels were suspended on a single bell crank with 2 bell cranks per side. The tracks were driven through the front sprockets. There were 2 return wheels. The suspension had troubles early on. with a tendency to pitch so badly on rough ground that the crew sometimes found it impossible to drive at any speed, and so it was modified with a brace to connect the pairs of bogies. Despite this, the tank continued to give its users a rough ride across any uneven ground. It was provided with an interior layer of asbestos padding separated from the hull with an air gap, to isolate the crew from the sun-heated armor plates, and to protect the crew from injury when the tank moved across rough terrain. Type 95 was fitted with 120 horsepower Mitsubishi A6120 VDE air-cooled diesel engine. Some tanks were fitted with 2 reflectors in the front of the vehicle for night operations. Variants: Type 95 Hargo, an early production version that differed from the most produced model by using less powerful armament. The main gun was 37 mm Type 94 with the barrel length of 36.7 calibers, muzzle velocity of 575 to 600 meters per second, armor penetration of 45 mm at 300 meters. Secondary armament consisted of the Type 91 6.5 mm machine guns, produced until 1937 with less than 100 made, used in Manchukuo and China. Of this variant, the very first production tanks used the older 110 horsepower Mitsubishi engine, and had a top speed of 25 miles per hour. Type 95 Hargo. Due to issues in Manchukuo with sorghum grass in fields getting trapped in the suspension wheels, the wheel suspension components were inverted so the tanks could move freely through the grass. This modified version was used in the battle for Nomonhan. Type 95 Hargo. Among other improvements to the engine and main gun, the secondary armament was changed to 2 Type 97 7.7 mm machine guns, one in the turret and one in the hull. Type 95 Riki crane vehicle. The Type 95 Riki was an engineering vehicle for field works. It had a 3-ton 4.5-meter boomed crane. Type 2 Army amphibious tank. This was the first amphibious tank produced in Japan, and was intended for use by the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces. The pontoons could be detached after landing by a 4th crewman from inside the tank. The chassis was based on the Type 95 Hargo. It was encountered by the United States Marine Corps in the Marshall Islands and Mariana Islands, particularly on Guam, where it was used in static defense positions. They were made in 1943, 1944, with 182 completed. Type 3K reproposition. This was a proposed model with a Type 97 57 mm gun as the main armament. This design never got past testing in 1943. Type 4K new conversion. The conversion that replaced the existing turret with the large turret of Type 97 Kaiha, armed with the low-velocity 57 mm gun. The conversion was done in 1944, with approximately 100 units completed. Type 5 Horu prototype. The Horu was a light tank destroyer similar to the German Hetzer, but armed with weaker 47 mm main gun. The Type 5 Horu utilized the chassis of the Type 95 light tank, but its suspension was enlarged to 350 mm track link width. The wheel guide pins were set in 2 rows to hold a road wheel between them. The sprocket of the driving wheel was the grating type to gear with the wheel guide pins like on the Soviet T-34. The development of the Type 5 Horu started in February 1945. Only a single prototype was completed. Ho to prototype. The Hota was a Type 38,120 mm howitzer mounted on the Type 95 Harger chassis. The gun had low velocity, but the heat shell could possibly penetrate the American M4 Sherman tank. This tank destroyer was developed in 1945 along with the Horu self-propelled gun. None were produced. Combat history. It is considered one of the best light tanks in 1935, being armed with a 37 mm cannon and powered by a diesel engine, a fuel considered by some to be superior due to its low volatility. As with most armies in the 1930s, including the U.S. Army, the tank, and the light tank in particular, were used primarily to support infantry as serve as cavalry reconnaissance and to a lesser extent as raiding vehicles. Its speed was about 18 miles per hour across country, which was comparable to the M3 Stuart's 20 miles per hour nearly 6 years later in 1941. In armor, road speed, and weaponry, the Type 95 was far inferior to the American M3 Stuart light tanks, which themselves were superior to the latest Japanese tank. But the environment of the Philippines largely minimized these disadvantages and allowed the Type 95 to be competitive, as its off-road speed and turret rotation was comparable. Type 95 proved sufficient against opposing infantry in campaigns in Manchuria and China, as the Chinese National Revolutionary Army had only 3 tank battalions consisting of Vickers export tanks, German PZK-PFWI light tanks, and Italian CV-33 tank kits to oppose them. However, the Type 95, like the US M3 Stuart, was not designed to fight other tanks, but for infantry support, and due to the IJN's priority in receiving new technology and steel for warship construction, tanks for the IJA were relegated to receiving what was left. By 1942, Japanese armor remained largely the same as it did in the 1930s, and was regarded as obsolete after 1941. The Type 95 was also used by Imperial Japanese Navy SNLF detachments in Pacific areas during the conflict. Khaken Gol 1939 under the mistaken belief that the Red Army was retreating from the area of the Khaken Gol River. The IJA command in Manchuria transferred the 1st Tank Corps under the command of Lt. Gen. Yasuoka Masayomi to the village of Nomonhan to cut off the retreating Soviets at Khaken Gol. After a 2-day journey by rail, the 1st Tank Corps began unloading its 3rd and 4th Tank Regiments from the trains at Arshan in Manchuria on the 22nd of June 1939. While the 3rd Tank Regiment was composed primarily of the nearly decade-old Type 89 medium tanks, the 4th Tank Regiment, commanded by 48-year-old Col. Tamada Yoshio, consisted of 35 Type 95 light tanks, 8 Type 89s, and 3 Type 94 tankards. For the beginning of Soviet General Zhukov's assumption of command at Nomonhan in June 1939, he had deployed his BT-5 and BT-7 light tanks, and incorporated them into all of his combined artillery, infantry, and armor attacks. Although in the same light tank category as the Type 95, also with 3-man crews and similar dimensions, the BT tanks were nearly twice as heavy, at 13.8 tons, but were highly susceptible to close-quarter teams using fire bombs, which was primarily due to their gasoline engines. As such, Japanese tankers held a generally low opinion of the Soviet tanks, but the BT tank's 45mm gun was an altogether different matter. With a velocity of over 2,000 feet per second, Soviet tanks could penetrate the Japanese tanks at a range of over 1,000 meters, as one Type 95 tank officer put it. No sooner did we see the flash, then there would be a hole in our tank. and the Russians were good shots too. On the 2nd of July 1939, at approximately 1810 hours, Col. Tamada's 4th Tank Regiment of more mobile Type 95 tanks took the lead in front of the medium tanks of the 3rd Tank Regiment, as the 1st Tank Corps launched its first offensive against the Soviet forces at Kharkhin, while the 3rd Tank Regiment passed through Soviet artillery fire, becoming decisively engaged by about 2000 hours during their movement forward. The 4th Tank Regiment, while avoiding Soviet artillery barrages, had advanced in a southeast direction instead of due south, engaging Russian force southwest of Uzerupond, observing a Russian artillery battery between himself and his objective, a junction. Col. Tamada ordered an attack in the darkness. At about 2300 hours, the 4th Tank moved towards their objective with about 6 meters between tanks and 30 meters between companies and platoons. Just after midnight, a thunderstorm struck, conveniently exposing the Russian positions while at the same time masking the advancing 4th Tank Regiment. While at close range, the lightning storm suddenly illuminated the advancing Type 95s, and the Soviet defense line immediately opened fire with heavy machine guns, artillery, BT-7 light tanks, and anti-tank guns. However, since the range was so close, the Russian artillery could not depress the barrels low enough to hit the tanks, and the shells flew wildly over the advancing tanks. At about 0:20 hours, Col. Tamada ordered the 4th Tank Regiment to charge, and by 2 o'clock hours his light tanks had penetrated over 1,000 yards through Russian lines and knocked out 12 artillery guns. Japanese losses consisted of 1 Type 95 light tank, 1 officer and 1 enlisted man killed and 8 wounded. The 4th Tank had expended approximately 1,137 mm and 129 57 mm tank shells, and 16,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition. After the action, the Soviet command acknowledged that 1st Tank Corps armor had reached the Russian guns. British Malaya and Burma 1941. Considering that the United States military had been operating in the Philippines since the Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902, and Great Britain had military bases in Singapore since at least the 1840s, combined, they both had at least 100 years of jungle warfare experience between them, which no doubt influenced the beliefs that tanks could not operate in those jungles. On the other hand, the IJA had always been focused upon Russia and China, and had never conducted major campaigns in jungle regions, facing impenetrable jungles, too experienced powerful armies, and lacking any combat jungle experience themselves. The IJA Type 95s led the assault forces into taking Singapore by the 15th of February, and Corregidor by April 1942. By those standards, the Type 95 proved to be an extremely successful light tank during the early campaigns leading into mid-1942. Poor planning on the part of the British Army resulted in few to none of any type of armor in British Malaya or Burma in December 1941. America's first clash of armor in World War II. America's first tank versus tank battle of World War II occurred when Type 95 light tanks of the IJA 4th Tank Regiment engaged a U.S. Army tank platoon, consisting of 5 brand-new M3 Stuart light tanks from B Company, 192nd Tank Battalion, on the 22nd of December 1941, north of Damortis during the retreat to the Bataan Peninsula in 1941. Both the M3 and Type 95 light tanks were armed with a 37 mm gun, but the M3 was better armored, with 32 mm thick turret sides versus the Type 95's 12 mm thick armor. However, based upon the Army's Ballistics Research Lab, which conducted the first large study of tank versus tank warfare in 1945, the conclusion was that the single most important factor in a tank duel was which side spotted the enemy first, shot first, and hit first. In this first engagement, the IJA reacted first, destroying the lead M3 as it tried to leave the road. The four remaining American tanks all suffered hits as they retreated. On 6/7 June 1942, the Japanese 3rd Special Naval Landing Forces landed on Kiska Island during the Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands, part of today's state of Alaska. The SNLF landing was reinforced by Type 95 light tanks from the IJA's 11th Tank Regiment, which became the only enemy tanks to ever land on North American soil. After the battle, 2 captured Type 95s were transported to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for study and evaluation, where they are on display today. 2 Type 95 tanks were deployed to support their Japanese landing at Milne Bay in late August 1942. Initially, the tanks proved successful against the lightly armed Australian infantry, whose sticky bombs failed to stick due to the humidity. Although the tanks had proved reliable in the tropical conditions of Malaya, they could not handle the volume of mud caused by intense, almost daily rainfall at Milne Bay. Both tanks were bogged down and abandoned a few days after the landing. 10-year-old warhorse, the Type 95 first began to show its vulnerability during later battles against British Commonwealth forces, where the tank's 37mm gun could not penetrate the armor of the British Matilda infantry tanks which were deployed against them. The thin armor of the Type 95 made it increasingly vulnerable, as Allied forces realized that standard infantry weapons were capable of penetrating the minimal armor around the engine block, and even its thickest armor could not withstand anything above rifle caliber. By 1944, it was already known that the 10-year-old Type 95 light tank's firepower was insufficient to take on the newest U.S. tanks, such as the medium M4 Sherman or the M5 Stuart light tank. Although the Type 95 could still give the older M3 Stuart light tank a run for its money at close range. In August 1942, the U.S. launched its first counter-offensive against Japan when it landed U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal. The U.S. Marine Corps deployed its first tank battalion, which was equipped with the only M2A4 light tanks to see combat with U.S. forces during World War II. The M2A4 was the foundation for the M3 Stuart, and both vehicles were nearly identical when viewed side by side, with the primary difference being the rear idler wheel lowered to the ground on the M3. Although the M2A4 was newer by 5 years, being built in 1940, than the Type 95, it was the closest U.S. tank in armament and armor to the Type 95 light tank, with 25mm thick turret sides versus the 95's 12mm turret sides, and both tanks were equipped with 37mm main guns. Several Type 95s were destroyed or captured by the United States Army during the Battle of Biak in 1944. As the tide of the war turned against Japan, the Type 95s were increasingly expended in banzai charges or were dug in as pillboxes in static defense positions in the Japanese-occupied islands. During the Battle of Tarawa, 7 entrenched Type 95s opposed American landings. More were destroyed on Parry Island and on Eniwetok. On Saipan, Type 95s attacked the American Marine beachhead on 16 June 1944, and more were used in the largest tank battle in the Pacific the following day. In the Battle of Guam on 21 July, 10 Type 95s were lost to bazooka fire or M4 tanks. 7 more were destroyed on Tinian on 24 July, and 15 more on Battle of Peleliu on 15 September. Likewise, in the Philippines, at least 10 Type 95s were destroyed in various engagements on Leyte, and another 19 on Luzon. At the Battle of Okinawa, 13 Type 95s and 14 Type 97 Shinha 2 medium tanks of the 27th Tank Regiment faced 800 American tanks. China-Burma India Theatre of Operations. In 1942 the IJA pushed through Southeast Asia, through Thailand and into Burma, and headed for India. Type 95 light tanks of the IJA 14th Tank Regiment led the way. They engaged the M3 Stuarts of the British 7th Hussars and 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, and as the British retreated towards India, the IJA ultimately resupplied the destroyed Type 95s with some captured M3 tanks. By 1944, the 14th Tank Regiment was starving to death due to British deep battle tactics of cutting the IJA's logistical lines, and a final push by the IJA was stopped at Imphal, India. In the Battle of Hukam Valley, Japanese Type 95 tanks of the 18th Division were joined by remnants of the 14th Tank Division. They were attacked by the Chinese Army in India's offensive from India, but they were virtually annihilated, with the rest of the division as only 1,700 out of the 12,000-strong Chrysanthemum Division managed to break out. When the M4 Sherman became available for the British to use in the North Africa campaign, they were able to transfer their M3 medium tanks to India and Burma. The Type 95 was outclassed by these. When the war ended, hundreds of Type 95s were left in China. They were used during the Chinese Civil War. Survivors. Although no surviving examples of the Type 95 light tank remain in Japan, a number have been preserved at museums around the world. In about 2007, the Oregon Military Museum sponsored the complete reconstruction of a Type 95 light tank. The tank is no longer operational, however, as the original engine encountered mechanical issues and lost oil pressure during a test drive. The Tank Museum, Bovington, United Kingdom. Kubinka Tank Museum, Moscow, Russia. Central Armed Forces Museum, Moscow, Russia. United States Army Ordnance Museum, United States. Oregon Military Museum, United States. National Armor and Amp Cavalry Museum, Fort Benning, United States. U.S. Army Museum of Hawaii, United States. Indiana Military Museum, United States. Adasorn Cavalry Center, Saraburi, Thailand. Australian War Memorial, Australia. Reserve Affairs Center, Thailand. Shurisak Montre Army Camp, Lampang, Thailand. Cavalry Tank Museum, Ahmednagar, Maharashtra, India. Japanese World War II units equipped with Type 95 Hargo. Units equipped with Type 95 Hargo. 1st Independent Mixed Brigade. 4th Tank Regiment. 1st Tank Regiment. 6th Tank Regiment, 7th Tank Regiment, 2nd Tank Regiment, 1st Company of 2nd Tank Regiment, 14th Tank Regiment, 1st Independent Tank Company, 2nd Battalion of 1st Army Sea Mobile Brigade, Tank Company of 1st Army Sea Mobile Brigade, Tank Company of 222nd Infantry Regiment, 9th Tank Regiment, Tank Unit of 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Company of 9th Tank Regiment, 2nd Company of 9th Tank Regiment, Tank Unit of 29th Division, Tank Unit of 36th Division, Tank Unit of 14th Division, 3rd Tank Division, 7th Independent Tank Company, 1st Independent Tank Company, 2nd Independent Tank Company, 1st Company of 4th Tank Regiment, 3rd Company of 4th Tank Regiment, 2nd Tank Division, 26th Tank Regiment, 27th Tank Regiment, 11th Tank Regiment, Training Group of Kungshuling Army Tank School of Kwantung Army, Kamayoshi Detachment, Shoji Detachment, Ito Detachment, Ito SNLF Detachment, Tank Platoon Unit of Kyo 5th SNLF, Tank Unit of Sasebo 7th SNLF, Macon Detachment of 3rd Naval Special Base Force, 55th Armor Guard Unit of Yokosuka 1st SNLF, Kwajalein Armor Detachment of Sasebo 7th SNLF. Operators: Japan. Primary operators: Thailand. In 1940 the Thai Army acquired approximately 50 Type 95s. A number of them spearheaded the Thai invasion of Burma's Shan states during the Second World War. In 1952 the tanks were decommissioned. Republic of China captured from the Japanese and used by National Revolutionary Army in Chinese Civil War. People's Republic of China. The Chinese Red Army captured examples from the National Revolutionary Army and received others captured by the Soviet Union. They were used in the Chinese Civil War and the Korean War alongside the Type 97 Kai-Ha. France using leftover Japanese equipment from the Japanese invasion of French Indochina. An ad hoc unit of French and Japanese armor was set up called the Commando Blindé du Cambodge and participated in the early stages of the First Indochina War.